My name is Therese Maloney. I am a member of Unite Trade Union and Executive Council member. I have the task of chairing this very important meeting here tonight. Our main speaker is Rob Griffiths, and I'll go on to give a little bit of information about Rob's background. And our support act is Eugene McCartan, who a lot of you will probably know very well. I would first of all like to ask you colleagues to join me in a minute's silence to remember our comrade Owen O'Neill, who died late last week. So if you could join me in a minute's silence. Thank you, colleagues.
Right, we had this meeting as planned was to try to provoke and develop a debate around Brexit, a left view, implications and opportunities. As part of a speaking tour that we have organised, it's one that we haven't done for a long time. So we have a speaking tour. The people over tonight is Rob Griffiths, as he's been introduced, and the other speaker will be Nick Wright. And we'd like to thank them for coming to Ireland to address an Irish audience regarding the major political earthquake that was the yes vote in the referendum in Britain to leave the European Union. The yes vote was not alone sent shockwaves through the British state, the British establishment, but its ripples have hit all capitals of the member states like a bolt of lightning, and indeed the US. Clearly, the establishment across the European Union have been totally taken by surprise that any sensible, progressive, far-sighted individual could possibly harbour thoughts of leaving, never mind voting to leave the European Union. The unspoken has been spoken. It is difficult at this juncture not to believe that the EU is in decline and has suffered a major political as well as psychological blow. Moments like this really do help to clarify who the enemy is and who the revolutionary forces are. Once again, social democracy jumps to the defence of monopoly capital rather than confront and embrace the opportunity for change. Fear takes hold. The Communist Party has for a long time been a critical voice against the European Union, against the constant hollowing out of democracy and sovereignty of the Irish people by the Irish state and the Irish ruling class. You cannot understand the European Union or what its role and function is if you ignore class and on whose class interests it serves. For too long, class has been removed from that discussion and debate on most issues, particularly regarding the European Union. The great crisis of 2008 revealed this country's economic vulnerability and how the Irish ruling class have created the conditions where they have traded away sovereignty and democracy for their own economic and political interests. They were exposed then as nothing more than gatekeepers for the interests of monopoly capitalism, both European and the United States. It is important that we show our solidarity with the British working class at this time. The European Union continues to push to strengthen its mechanisms of control and domination. There are great dangers in the current conditions that the powerful states will push for further and deeper controls. The new financing rules announced by the ECB or the EU Commission's Jean-Claude Juncker produced his new white paper on the future of the European Union, harbouring such strategies. It is clear that Angela Merkel and others, the core powers, support scenario 3, that wish to go along with the European Commission and to strengthen the centre against the peripheral states. It raised the possibility of a coalition of the willing, a cohort of member states to use the option provided by the Treaty of Lisbon that allows permanent structured cooperation in various fields, such as domestic surveillance, repression and closer collaboration in foreign and military powers. They seek to pave the way for a greater and faster assertion of the European Union as an imperialist bloc, which can only lead to further interventionist and militarist policies as we've seen in Ukraine. This can only strengthen NATO and sped up the militarisation of the European Union. The Irish state is increasingly involved in this imperialist military alliance. Its agenda includes the promotion of instability, continuing war in various parts of the world. For capital, the logic of concentration and centralisation must continue. For it to reproduce itself in the current structures of capital accumulation, and in Europe, that means that the EU must continue to concentrate power in itself. If it is to continue in doing that, it must continue to hollow out democracy of the member states. Every treaty and the continuous torrent of legislation has undermined the authority and the jurisdiction of the member states. Real power lies in the centre of Berlin and Brussels. By strengthening and tightening the financial controls, the ECB hoped to keep in check the peripheral peoples and states. These countries are not just a source of capital extraction in the form of debt repayments, but is also a huge reserve army of labour. The European Union is showing growing strains of deepening economic and financial instability in its core powers, such as Germany, France and Italy. While we witness the growth of reactionary and chauvinistic forces which exploit the people's disillusion with the EU, there is no doubt that the left's failure to defend national sovereignty and democracy against the ever-increasing authority of the EU institutions has left the field open to the right. Strengthening the European Union and the euro will not bring about a solidarity that has never existed, but will reinforce the prevalence of the interests of the main powers of the European Union. It is the concentration and centralisation of economic power for monopoly capital. This is not progressive. This is not something the left should support. The promotion and universalisation of capitalism is the guiding principle of the EU. Its laws are aimed at preventing national governments from showing favour to public enterprise or even nationally based firms. The Irish state and the ruling class it represents have operated in alliance with the imperialist centres of Brussels, London and Washington, albeit in a subservient position. The Brexit vote has put them in a state of confusion. They have opted for continuing a policy of dependency and submission to the European Union, subordinating the interests of the Irish people to that of the European Union and the USA. We believe that sections of the Irish left and the Labour movement have not fully understood the importance of combating the European imposed debt and have continued our continued membership of the euro and recovering the tools that ensure economic and budgetary and monetary sovereignty. It has meekly accepted the official political consensus of the nature of the EU, clinging to the myth of social Europe, just occasionally uttering mild criticism. It is hobbled by its lack of class analysis and class politics. It is only through a class outlook that we can arrive at any understanding and formulate a policy in the interest of the working people and the Irish nation. For example, working people have, for now, defeated the state's attempt to impose water charges. The Fianna Fáil-Fine Gael counter-attack involves the evoking of EU law, which they say is embodied in our constitution. It follows that to continue with the water campaign means confronting the European Union. If the Irish establishment parties are in a state of confusion regarding Brexit, it also applies to significant elements within the Irish left. National democracy and sovereignty are not optional extras, but they are essential tools for the people to develop politically, culturally and economically. They are the essential keys to unlocking the triple lock of imperialist domination over our people by the US, the European Union and Britain. Confronting and breaking the power of monopoly capital is not easy or clean. It won't always happen on terms that we wish or dictate. Anyone who thinks so is foolish. We must continue to fight for the fractures in monopoly capital power, and the Brexit vote is one of the most crucial ones so far. But fight to reclaim sovereignty and national democracy for the left and for the working class interests. To retreat now and limit our struggle to individual rights, and as some left do, is either misguided or worse, cowardly. There can be no advance for the working people while monopoly capital usurps power and control. This is our fight. Thank you, Thomas.
He's been a full-time General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain since 1998. A Welsh-speaking native of Cardiff, he was the Parliamentary Research Officer for Plaid Cymru, the Welsh National Party in the 1970s. Previously a trade union tutor and university senior lecturer in economics and history, he's written numerous books and pamphlets on the labour movement, the national question, Marxism and political economy. He was previously Welsh President of the trade union AUEW-TAS, and today he takes a leading role in the work of the People's Assembly against austerity and chaired the Left Exit campaign during the referendum on the EU. So Rob, if you'd like to...
Okay, thanks very much. And thank you, comrades, for the invitation. I must say, I began to see the potential benefits, one that I hadn't previously thought of Britain's exit from the European Union when I arrived at Dublin Airport this morning from Cardiff. And the queue for those from the EU was absolutely enormous, and there was nobody in the other queue for non-EU travellers. So should you invite me back again in a couple of years' time, I'm looking forward to going straight to the desk instead of having to wait half an hour. But more seriously, of course there are many people on the left, not just in Ireland, or for that matter, as I've experienced recently in Portugal or France, but in Britain still, who want to know why did the Communist Party of Britain and others on the left, why did we call for a vote to leave the European Union last June the 23rd? And I would begin my answer by just providing perhaps some brief historical perspective. For most of the 1950s, 60s and 70s, almost all of the communist and socialist left across Western Europe opposed the Treaty of Rome and the European Common Market. They were absolutely clear that this project was not only one of seeking to rebuild big Western European capitalist monopolies after, of course, all of the destruction of the Second World War, but this was, above all, a political and ideological project, born out of the Cold War, a product of the Cold War, against the advance of socialism, and, of course, across Europe, west and east, the advance of communist parties. We shouldn't forget the very specific conditions in which the first substantial steps were taken towards what is now the European Union. The earliest treaties to establish what later became the EU weren't just the European Coal and Steel Community. It was the formation of a European political community that proved to be short-lived, a European defence community, for Western Europe only, of course, a European defence community that was only scuppered thanks to the votes of the hundreds of communist and Gaullist deputies in the French National Assembly, Euratom, for cooperation on the development of nuclear power, which of course we now understand was undertaken primarily for the purposes of nuclear armaments, and associated projects such as that. In other words, it was never just an economic project, or even primarily an economic project, although of course that was pretty fundamental as well. But it took place in such conditions that one cannot, and we never used to, ignore the profound political and ideological context in which that happened. Those early steps, of course, were nothing to do with the internationalism of workers or the internationalism of socialists or of communists. This was about the internationalism of the bosses and their capitalist states, a very different kind of internationalism. And they were able to succeed to a limited degree at first, despite, of course, the contradictions involved. The fact that for all of their unity against socialism and communism, they were still rivals as capitalist monopolies and capitalist states. And there were many involved in that project at the very beginning whose perspective for this European coal and steel community and later the European common market was that it should develop into a rival economic power to the United States and later on Japan and so on. But nevertheless, despite the failure of the political community and the defence community, as we know, the coal and steel community proceeded and since has become not only the European Common Market and the European Economic Community, but now the European Union, with explicit political and military dimensions that its founders intended from the very beginning. And Lenin wrote in 1916, when he criticised those on the left who were calling for, in effect, a united socialist states of Europe, he said, look, the only possibility that is on the horizon at the moment is a United States of Europe, of capitalist and imperialist states of Europe, that will either be impossible because of the rivalries involved, or it will be reactionary because of the character of the economic and political forces that would be behind it. And it's because of that character that, in fact, the Communist Party in Britain, for example, opposed the first attempts for Britain to join the European Common Market. We opposed Britain's accession to the Common Market in 1973, and we campaigned against continued membership when we were finally given a referendum after already being taken in. We campaigned against continuing membership in 1975, but not just the Communist Party. Almost all of the left in the Labour movement in Britain was very clear about the character of the European Common Market and campaigned for a no vote. And we were defeated. All of the power and wealth of big business was lined up on the other side. Big business was very clear in 1975, as it was last year in Britain. The vast bulk of big business has always been in favour of the European Common Market project and supported and funded the campaign, the official campaign for a Remain vote last June, on June the 23rd. So, if that was once the almost united position of the left, what changed it? What led to the breakdown of that consensus? And again, just I think an historical perspective might help to answer that question. Because from 1979 we had the election of the Thatcher government in Britain. We had successive election victories for Thatcher and her allies. And those of us who were active in the Labour movement in Britain back then can well recall, and I can see Nick at the back of the room, at the front of the room, another comment, can well recall the mood of pessimism and defeatism that was growing in the Labour movement throughout the course of the 1980s. In fact, it even reached a point where there were serious articles in journals like the New Statesman and, heaven help us, even in Marxism Today. There were serious articles that said not only would Britain never again see another Labour government, so total was the political and ideological triumph of the Tories and so-called Thatcherism. We were told not only was it politically and ideologically impossible for the Labour movement and the left to recover from that, it was even mathematically impossible that we would ever see another majority Labour government. That was being seriously argued, not just by fringe elements. It was a mathematical impossibility to overcome those Tory election victories and that Tory majority. And so when Jacques Delors, as president of the European Commission, a French socialist whose political career had been dedicated to undermining and attacking the influence of the French Communist Party as the main force on the left in France, as it was for decades, when Jacques Delors came along to the TUC conference in 1988 and said, "I feel your pain, but you have friends in the European Commission You have friends elsewhere in Europe in the social democratic and socialist parties, and we're going to ensure that we have a social charter and a social chapter and a social Europe that will defend your employment and trade union and social rights against the Thatcher government and its reactionary policies. I'm afraid there were all too many in that hall who swallowed it, who believed what Delors was telling them and took him at his word. And of course what subsequently happened was that Delors was championing the Maastricht Treaty, the further centralisation of capitalist power in the European Union, and his social chapter was not worth the paper it wasn't even written on. And we had the minimal rights that were granted, most of which already existed in British law at that time. In fact, the rights that we had under British law, won by the labour movement in struggle, were far in excess of anything that was promised in the social chapter. And by the way, that wasn't just true of Britain, it was true of many other countries in Western Europe where the working class has been prepared to fight for its rights and to extend its position in society. So we had the Maastricht Treaty, we had the European single market, we had the enshrinement of monetarism in that Maastricht Treaty, we had new powers for the economic and financial powers for the European Commission, we had the European monetary system set up as the precursor to everybody eventually joining the euro, and we had the establishment of the European Central Bank, which again the Maastricht Treaty was quite clear must be independent. What they meant by that, of course, was independent of any democratically elected representatives or bodies. That was the Maastricht Treaty. And by the way, as far as those promises to defend us against the excesses of Thatcher and Tory rule and so on, between 1979 and 1993 in Britain, we had at least 13 pieces of anti-trade union, anti-employment rights legislation in Britain, and the European Union didn't lift a finger to stop any of it. Never has and never will. And it's a little sad to see trade unionists in Britain, senior representatives in the trade union movement, bemoaning the vote last June the 23rd because they say it will leave us defenceless against future Tory governments. Without the European Union there to back us, we're going to be defenceless. Again, it's the same pessimism and defeatism that proved so completely misplaced and so wrong in the 1980s is still with us. It's as if the working class movement in Britain, or anywhere else for that matter, is completely incapable of defending itself, and we need the bankers and the bureaucrats in Frankfurt and Brussels in order to do it for us. Pitiful, absolutely pitiful. Why should we have to relive that mistake all over again? And of course, even since then, even since the Maastricht Treaty, we've seen where that led. We've seen where that those new monetary mechanisms and those new powers for the European Commission and the establishment of that European Central Bank, we've seen where that's led with the vicious punishment beatings meted out to ordinary workers and ordinary families in one country after another in the European Union. So much for the social Europe. So much for the protection that the European Union was going to give ordinary people. Then, of course, we've had the Lisbon Treaty, the Lisbon Constitutional Treaty, as they renamed it, where once again, additional powers to the European Commission were not only granted, they've been entrenched in the fundamental treaties now, the two fundamental treaties of the European Union. Entrenches enormous power in the hands of that European Commission. This is a European Commission that has the power to draft and initiate legislation. It has the power, it's written there in black and white. I'm sad enough to read these treaties late at night, helps me get off to sleep and so on. It's there in black and white. On a good night, I can even quote the specific article number for you. It's there in black and white. If the European Parliament requests the Commission to draft an outline law for it, the European Commission has the power to refuse to do so. But they must explain in writing why. How preposterous that the elected representatives in what's supposed to be a parliament asks the civil service to do something and the civil service can just say no, but it has to set out the reasons in writing. You have to ask, what kind of parliament is that? And by the way, if the European Parliament wants to initiate a Europe-wide petition, it has to get the agreement of the European Commission to do that. You might also wonder why by far the most prolific speaker in the European Parliament is President, one of the 5 non-elected presidents in the European Union institutions, President Juncker. He's on his feet all the time in the European Parliament. He's not an MEP. But again, it's enshrined in the basic treaties of the European Union. The Commission, a representative of the Commission, can address the European Parliament whenever they request to do so. Can you imagine that? I don't know if this happens in the Dáil, but in the House of Commons in Britain, it would be unthinkable for any civil servant at any level to stand up and address MPs, and even more so, to tell them off because they're being a bit unreasonable or a bit presumptuous. I mean, even in pathetic establishment and class-ridden Britain, any civil servant who did that would be dismissed. It's enshrined in law that the European Commission and its president has the power to do that. Only a couple of years ago, I used to, one of my feeble attempts at a joke in a public speech would be to say that the European Parliament is the most powerless elected body in the whole of Europe, with the exception of the National Assembly of Wales. Because the European Parliament has no fundraising powers of its own and cannot even initiate legislation. I'm afraid I can't even use that line anymore. The Welsh Assembly has now the powers to initiate its own legislation. It has to ask for permission from the House of Commons and the House of Lords and the Queen of England and so on, but nevertheless it can initiate its own laws. Soon it will have the power to raise its own funds. The European Parliament doesn't have those powers. It's not a real parliament. It's a sham. It's a facade. What the European elites have managed to do with the whole edifice that they've constructed as far as the European Union institutions are concerned, what they've managed to do, they think they've found the answer to bourgeois democracy. Because once you give people the vote, ordinary people the vote, there's always the danger, everything is done to prevent it of course, but there's always the danger they might come up with the wrong answer. They might vote for the wrong party or the wrong type of government. So you keep giving them the vote, you give them a European Parliament, you just make sure it doesn't have any powers. And all the powers are concentrated, in reality, in the European Commission and the European Central Bank. This is their answer to the problem that has been posed by the universal franchise and the struggle of ordinary people to get the vote. And what the Lisbon Treaty also provided for, of course, was the development of a common foreign and security policy for the European Union. In fact, it even established the position of a High Commissioner for foreign and security policy. Baroness Ashton, I think she's recently retired, but she was the first High Commissioner, Baroness Ashton. You may not have heard of her. She represented you and all of us in Britain and all of us throughout Europe at the United Nations, at the G20, at all kinds of summits. She's popped up speaking on behalf of the European Union. She's never been elected to anything in her entire political life. She might have been elected milk monitor when she was at public school, I'm not sure. But this is the farcical position that we've arrived at. A High Commissioner for the common foreign and security policy for the European Union. Moreover, and again, if you read Protocols 10 and 11 to the Treaty on the European Union, it spells it out, that common foreign and security policy is linked to a policy of militarization, of the merger of new European Union military mechanisms with the Western European Union, which is the Western European arm of NATO. That has proceeded apace. In fact, the Western European Union has now been dissolved into the EU, and it's spelt out. I've had to point this out to some of our CND, my fellow members and friends in CND. It spells out in protocol, I think it's protocol 10 rather than protocol 11, that the common foreign and security policy of the European Union must contribute to the vitality of a renewed Atlantic alliance. There it is in black and white. The European Union is officially and formally aligned with NATO. And this is not just a law that can easily be repealed or a policy that can be changed. Who knows if we were to get a Jeremy Corbyn-led government in Britain. Corbyn has always made no secret of his opposition to NATO. It's not inconceivable that we could win the position of Britain withdrawing from NATO. We'd only have to pass a law. NATO, the European Union is aligned with NATO in its fundamental constitutional treaty, which you can't repeal, we can't repeal in Britain if we were to continue to be members of the European Union. But that is what we are all signed up to for as long as we're in the European Union. And of course, we had no referendum in Britain on the Lisbon Treaty, Mark I or Mark II. We had no referendum on the Maastricht Treaty. We were promised referendums on both of these treaties, by the way. And of course, we've looked on in envy as we've seen the people of Ireland have several referendums on the question of the European Union and the development of the United States of Europe. The problem is, of course, is you've come up with the wrong answers. So you had to have it again until you came up with the right one. And by the way, when you were voting against those greater centralising powers for the European Union, all of those people who voted for that in Ireland, did that represent a thoroughly racist, xenophobic, nationalist, reactionary vote? Because that's what you're being told now about the vote in Britain. All of a sudden, one of the comrades told me earlier in the bookshop downstairs, all of a sudden it would seem we've got 17 million members of the Ku Klux Klan in Britain, or 17 million UKIP members. The vote for UKIP at the last general election was less than 3 million. Where did the other 14 million come from? Even if you added in the entire vote for the Conservative Party, you'd still have millions you'd have to try and explain. The reality is, of course, it was overwhelmingly a working class vote. The majority of working class people voted against the European Union. More than 1/3 of Labour voters voted against the European Union. A majority of Plaid Cymru voters voted against the European Union. Almost 1/3 of SNP voters voted against the European Union. A majority of Sikhs voted against the European Union. A majority of Jewish people voted against the European Union. More than 1/3 of black and ethnic minority voters in Britain voted against the European Union. Have we all suddenly been converted to the BNP or UKIP? Of course not. Ridiculous idea. Now, having said that, one has to admit the question of immigration was a big issue. And there are different kinds of opposition to some of Britain's immigration policies and those that have been imposed by EU membership. Some of it is a genuine, if misplaced, concern about the impact of mass immigration in certain parts of Britain on public services and so on. Misinformed, ignorant, because we're clear about the benefits that immigration has brought to our public services, and we said that strongly on every platform during the EU referendum campaign. There were also concerns about the way in which big business has imported hundreds of thousands of migrant workers into Britain to super-exploit them in order to undermine negotiated terms and conditions, provoking a whole series of strikes on construction sites, power stations and so on. Not because those workers who went on strike are opposed to foreigners or even opposed to migrant workers. What they're opposed to is the organised, systematic undermining of pay and conditions and trade union agreements in Britain. You can't lump all of this together and simply say, oh, well, they're all racists, they're all xenophobes. That is not the position at all, and that's not our experience, and it wasn't our experience on the picket lines during those disputes either. And by the way, when I talk about big business importing hundreds of thousands of workers to undermine pay and conditions and trade unionism, let's not forget this is a position that has been reinforced by 4 key rulings of the European Court of Justice, the EU's court, the Viking, Laval, Ruffert and Luxembourg cases, that make it clear trade unions taking industrial action to try and enforce equal terms and conditions for migrant workers, because that's what some of the unions were doing, by the way, that is unlawful, according to the European Court of Justice. A national government, a member state government, or a devolved government, as in Wales or Scotland, actually trying to legislate to compel companies that import workers in order to super-exploit them, that too is unlawful. In other words, this racket is totally, not only endorsed, it's enforced by the European Court of Justice. And of course we've had further reactionary rulings even in the last year or two, even in the last week or two. We've had judgments undermining the rights of workers who've been made redundant, and we've had judgments undermining the rights of workers whose jobs have been outsourced. And now we've had this recent ruling from the EU Court of Justice telling employers that they have the power to ban certain types of dress, certain types of badges, certain types of brooches and necklaces and so on that their employees might choose to wear. And not because they are in breach of health and safety. That has always been the position. But on general grounds, that it might upset the employer or it might upset some customers, some bigoted customers, let's be frank about that. So this is the real character of the European Union. This is why the Communist Party, 3 national trade unions, others on the left, the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Indian Workers' Association, the Bangladeshi Workers' Council. This is why we established Lexit, and this is why we ran the campaign that we did in the referendum. We were no part of any of the official campaigns. We were not interested, totally opposed to sharing platforms with UKIP or the Tories or anybody putting forward some of the reactionary arguments against EU membership. We were very clear. We were against the EU because it is anti-democratic, anti-working class, imperialist, militarist and racist. Again, let's not forget what's happened as far as that is concerned. The reality is, in Britain and in the Netherlands and in Denmark, what were once relatively relaxed rules about immigration and nationality, those barriers to people from outside Europe, we've been compelled to raise them. Now, of course, there are plenty in the Tory party only too happy to raise them. The EU provides a perfect excuse. But to balance the mass immigration of workers from Eastern Europe, what's actually happened is that we have raised the barriers to workers and family members from the Asian subcontinent, from the Caribbean. In other words, whites can come in from elsewhere in Europe, but the barriers against everybody else have been raised as a direct result of membership of the European Union. So we were clear about the campaign that we were running for democracy, for workers' rights, for the ability and capacity and lawful right of member states to intervene in the economy in the interests of ordinary working people. There were, as I say, there were others who were against the EU for reactionary reasons. There were people against the Iraq war for reactionary reasons, because they didn't think we should have anything to do with foreigners. That was the BNP in Britain. The fascists were against the Iraq war. Did that stop us from campaigning against the Iraq war because we might be mixed up with fascists? We certainly made sure they played no part in the Stop the War coalition, and if they'd have ever dared to turn up to a march, they would have been evicted. No, we campaigned against the Iraq war because it was the right position in principle, and we campaigned against the EU because we understood its anti-democratic, anti-working class and big business character. And just because there were some on the right wing of the Tory party, UKIP, campaigned against the EU. Let's be as objective as we can about this. Almost all of British big business, the City of London, the Confederation of British Industry, the very right-wing Institute of Directors, Goldman Sachs, the mainstream Tory government, they were all completely in favour of staying in the European Union. They were quite clear about where their class interests lie. Whatever a few maverick bankers and a few maverick right-wing politicians thought, most of the Tory cabinet, most of big business was very clear about wanting to stay in the European Union. It was only sections of the left that were in a state of total confusion, imagining that the European Union has somehow morphed into this wonderful progressive organisation that just wants to defend the interests of ordinary working people, even as it's handing out those punishment beatings to ordinary people in Ireland and Spain and Portugal and Cyprus and Greece. What a travesty, and what a tragic misunderstanding. Well, we had the vote, we had the majority in favour of leaving the European Union. I've said a little bit about who comprised that majority. Overwhelmingly a working class vote, and a lot of it, yes, it wasn't because people like me have read all the basic treaties and have decided, oh, that doesn't sound right and that doesn't sound. It was also, a large part of that vote was gut instinct. It was people who've been marginalised, neglected, exploited, oppressed, ignored, and they saw this as an opportunity to kick the establishment. They knew full well that the establishment wanted to stay in the European Union. And they decided to give them a kick. And they did it. And millions of people voted in that referendum, by the way, who've never voted before, and certainly hadn't voted in the previous general election. That's how motivated they felt to express their anger. And it reminds me a little of what Lenin said about socialist revolution. He said, those who want to live to see, those who want a pure socialist revolution will never live to see it. You will never have that pure event whereby all the progressives line up on one side and all the reactionaries line up neatly on the other, battle commences and the good guys win. It doesn't happen like that. And similarly with the European Union, there were terribly reactionary arguments on both sides. But what we have to do, as socialists and communists, is to try and analyse these things objectively. Whose class interests are served by the European Union? Whose class interests would have been served by staying in the European Union? Whose class interests could be served, not only by upsetting the apple cart, but working out the ways in which we can now press home any advantage, which brings me finally to the position we're in today. The day after the referendum result, Jeremy Corbyn, who has a long history of opposing the European Union, by the way, but because of the compromises he's had to do with an overwhelmingly hostile Labour Party in Parliament, agreed in the end to campaign to remain, although he was very critical of the European Union. The morning after the result, Corbyn said, the British people have spoken, that decision now has to be implemented. Of course, the whole of the right wing of the Parliamentary Labour Party immediately decided we're going to have another go at getting him out. And they sparked an enormous crisis in the Labour Party. Yet again, they forced a second leadership election. That diverted the Labour Party and the Labour movement for 6 months and more, when what we should have been doing was to say, the people have spoken, popular sovereignty demands that we leave the European Union. Now let's make sure we leave them on terms that are in the interests of the working class, and not whatever Theresa May and the Tories can do. Well, we thought it would be Cameron for a while longer, so he threatened. But instead of what they can recover from the situation, we should have gone straight onto the offensive. And we didn't. Because of the confusion around about the character of the European Union, we had that campaign. And it's still going on, by the way. Not only against Jeremy Corbyn, but to try and undermine and reverse and sabotage that decision of last June. They may yet succeed. They've tried everything. They've tried legal action, they've tried parliamentary rebellions, they've tried the House of Lords, and it's very strange to see all these Guardian reading liberals all of a sudden becoming the champions, the defenders of wealthy hedge funders who are taking the British government to court, the House of Lords, the Supreme Court, all of their attempts to sabotage the referendum result being defended by Labour MPs, by Guardian reading liberals, by the Green Party, by Liberal Democrats, and so on. We'll see whether they succeed or not. But we're very clear. What needs to happen in our view as the Communist Party and our allies, what needs to happen now is whatever positions were taken up until the June 23rd referendum, what we now need to do is to join in the fight against Theresa May so that we get a people's exit, not a fallback big business type exit from the European Union. And what does that mean? It means respecting the decision. It means implementing the verdict of the people, popular sovereignty. It means no membership of the European single market or membership of the European Economic Area. And why do we say that? Well, our view is because we're still fighting for a left-led Labour government. We haven't given up. We're not defeatists and pessimists like so many were in the 1980s. We think it's going to be possible to get a left-led government in Britain. We want that government to be able to intervene decisively in the economy. We want it to be able to fund infrastructure programmes through borrowing if necessary. We want it to be able to issue public sector bonds through the Bank of England to finance huge capital programmes, something explicitly outlawed in the fundamental treaties of the European Union. We want it to be able to control trade. We've got a huge crisis to preserve even the existence of a steel industry in Britain. And of course what the European Union and its supporters are doing is pointing the finger at China and saying, well, it's the Chinese imports, that's what's undermining. Britain imports 7 times more steel from the rest of the European Union than it does from China. If we need to limit imports temporarily while we protect and modernise the steel industry, preferably under public ownership, which is the only way we did it last time, a British government, a left-led government, has to be free to be able to do that. We want to see a left-led government in Britain free to legislate against the super-exploitation of migrant workers. We want unions to be free to take industrial action, to enforce equal terms and conditions for migrant workers. We want control over public ownership. We want to see preferential treatment for public enterprise, where that's viewed to be in the interests of our economy and the interests of the working class. We want control over public finances. When even this Conservative government, the Lib Dem Tory coalition, came under enormous pressure to zero rate VAT on women's sanitary products. That was a unanimous view in Parliament. Every party said it's ridiculous. It's a necessity. There shouldn't be any VAT rate on sanitary products. We had a democratically elected government had to go pleading to Brussels, to the European Commission, will you please allow us to zero rate VAT on sanitary products? What an intolerable situation. If a democratically elected government wants to zero rate VAT on gas or electricity or water or anything else, surely it should have the right to do that. You don't have that right in the European Union. The SNP, big supporters of the European Union. They didn't used to be, by the way. When I worked in Parliament for the Plaid Cymru MPs in the 1970s, Plaid Cymru and the SNP were anti-European Union. They've all done somersaults. When the SNP announced it was going to launch a big investment programme in infrastructure, clinics, hospitals, roads, schools in Scotland, it was going to launch a £10 billion infrastructure programme, and they devised some clever device of an arm's length, not-for-profit charity organisation that was going to get public sector bonds to finance it to do this. The European Commission stepped in and said, you can't do it. you've got to have private sector finance in there, which of course will be 3 times more expensive than any other way of doing it. The SNP government has folded completely. 46 out of 50 or so major capital investment projects are now going to be funded from private sector finance, and the Scottish government is going to end up paying 5 times the value of those capital assets in unitary charges over the next 30 years. That is a direct result of being in the EU, not a squeak from an SNP government that says it wants sovereignty. It wants independence in the European Union. It wants independence, but it wants to be dependent on pound sterling and the Bank of England for its currency. It wants to be dependent on the European Union for permission to carry out economic and financial policies, and it wants to be dependent on NATO for its defence and foreign policies. I'm sorry, that's not any kind of independence that I recognise. As far as we're concerned in the Communist Party in Britain, the question of Scottish or Welsh independence isn't a matter of principle. That the people of Wales and Scotland have the right to be independent is a matter of principle that we would defend to the last. Whether it's necessarily the right thing to do in any set of conditions, for us is a matter of revolutionary strategy. But I'll tell you what, I would have a lot more respect for Scottish nationalists if they actually believed in genuine national independence. We can agree or disagree about whether now are the best conditions in which to do that. But a Scottish nationalist who wants to be dependent on the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the European Commission and the Pentagon, I'm sorry, that's not any kind of patriot or internationalist or nationalist that I can recognise. So, comrades, we're putting forward this agenda for a people's exit. We want to see it on terms, yes, of course, low tariff or zero tariff trade with the European Union if possible. We want to regain control over our immigration laws so that we can extend the rights of people wanting to come to Britain from the Asian subcontinent and the Caribbean and Africa and so on. We want to regain control over agriculture so that we don't have this massively corrupt and wasteful common agricultural policy. We want an independent foreign and defence policy that is not aligned with NATO by fundamental constitutional treaty that can't be changed. Of course, we want to continue scientific and environmental cooperation with other countries in Europe. And of course, we want to see all of the progressive measures that have come out of the European Union, usually from 20 and 30 years ago, we want to see those continue and maintained in British law. But we have to unite the labour movement around a people's exit. We have to put this argument about whether June the 23rd was legitimate or should be implemented or not. That needs to be put to rest. We need to unite the left, unite the labour movement around this perspective, not only of a people's exit, not only of progressive federalism and the redistribution of wealth across Britain, but also around the perspective of the struggle for a left-led Labour government. Everybody is telling you, the media in Britain and probably around the world are telling you it's not going to happen. Corbyn is already on his last legs. He's been about to collapse and resign now for close on 2 years. We'll see what happens as far as the Labour leadership is concerned. But that we will have a left-led Labour Party and a possibility of a left-led Labour government is still all to fight for and all to be decided. And that's the context as well in which we demand a people's exit from the EU. And in the centenary year of the great revolutions in Russia in 1917, why shouldn't we be demanding the impossible? Demand the impossible and win the impossible. Because that's what revolutionaries did in Russia in 1917. And I'm not saying we're going to be able to repeat all of that in the exact form or even in the very near future. But we totally reject this defeatist, pessimistic, demoralising approach that too many on the left have adopted towards the EU. The EU can be challenged. I'll finish on this. I've been in Portugal. I've been speaking to communists in Portugal. I went to the international meeting of communist and workers' parties in Vietnam, 80, 90 parties from all around the world. I lost count of the number of communists from parties in Europe who came up to me and said, "Do you know what you've done in Britain? Do you know the most significant thing that you've done in Britain by voting against EU membership? You have shattered the myth that there is no alternative and there never can be any alternative. You came close to shattering that myth on two occasions in Ireland. We have now shattered that myth, and we intend to ensure that that is maintained. It is possible to challenge the European Union. It is possible to escape from the European Union and its anti-democratic, anti-working class, pro-imperialist policies and treaties.
A big thanks to our two speakers. What I'm going to do now is throw it open to the floor for some questions and answers.